Here we go. So here we are with Dick Levine and Eva DeLuna Castro, and tell us what we heard. What did we hear? What did we not hear?
Well, the bottom line number, the big number is $104.87 billion, about $105 billion for general purpose spending. We don't think that's going to be enough for the state to even keep doing what it's doing now. Is that right?
Right, that would take about 109 billion, and that's not fully covering, for example, the cost of inflation for schools. So the way our budget is written doesn't totally take into account everything costs more in the next 2 years. But 109 is like the bare minimum to not be cutting state services.
So there's a couple of reasons that the state's going to be so far short. One is one of the changes that they made last session, which is to take sales tax revenue over a certain amount, and instead of leaving it in the budget to be decided by the Appropriations Committee, sending it straight to the highway fund for roads. That means that the sales tax, which is the major tax, it provides more than half of all the money that the legislature uses for general spending. The sales tax will be essentially flat from last biennium to this biennium because any normal growth in it has gone straight off to the highway fund.
And then other money that's not available as general revenue goes to the Economic Stabilization Fund. So that's one thing we didn't hear, but it's good news. There's going to be almost $12 billion in the Economic Stabilization Fund by 2019. And that's money the legislature could choose to use, as it has in the past, to keep state aid to schools, health care, public safety from at least where it is right now, just to stabilize the economy, because schools and health care are major parts of our state economy.
And because the big number, the $105 billion, is so far short of what they need, this is a session where they have to get quite serious about discussing using the rainy day fund for what it's intended for, which is to prevent harmful cuts to basic services.
Can you tell us some more about the rainy day fund and what is there, how often we use or don't use it?
Well, it gets money from oil and mainly from oil and gas revenue above a certain level from about 30 years ago when it was created. But we've used it for many, many things. Eva can give you details.
Does the oil price decline? Does that hurt the stabilization fund at all? Or?
Well, I haven't looked at the numbers. I have a feeling that the natural gas is not providing much of anything because natural gas prices are so low.
Yeah, there was no deposit this year at all from that, just oil severance taxes.
But the main thing is the balance is going to be $12 billion. That's a pretty significant amount of money. They've already set what they consider the minimum sufficient balance at about $7.5 billion. That leaves $4.5 billion that's there and sort of recognized as available if they're willing to do it to prevent harmful cuts.
Does this estimate qualify as a shortfall?
Yes, it's short of even what we're spending in 2016, 2017, which is $106 billion. So this wouldn't even pay for the last 2 years worth of services.
Okay.
And the ending balance that we heard about to start the next session, actually we're in the hole because dedicated balances that are earmarked for things like trauma and environmental protection, they're kind of covering up that situation we're already in. So dedicated balances are the only reason this doesn't put us in the red already.
How much would the state need to just maintain current services?
$109 billion is current law. So basically, like, assuming that property taxes go up to pay for schools, that's current law. If we had fully covered inflation and other parts of the budget, we would be closer to $111 billion. So I would think, however you describe compared to what we're doing already, this is not a good situation.
Right. For instance, current law doesn't make any adjustment for inflation for public education. So they've been the basic allotment, the building block for everything else is just staying flat under current law.
For 4 years in a row. Yeah, that's the problem.
So if you need to pay teachers more in order to keep them. If you make those kinds of adjustments, that's what gets us from the 109 current law to, what did you say, 111?
Yes.
Just to keep up.
It also doesn't include the commitments that we've heard about. Our state leaders want to make improvements to child protective services. That's not current law. That would be more going above and beyond what we currently do. Mental health improvements, additional funding for border security, if that's a legislative priority. So that's, again, all of those are beyond what we're currently doing. So that takes that number even higher.
So in your experience, you watched this for a long time, what becomes most attractive to try to in terms of cuts?
Well, legislators, based on history, have first tried things like smoke and mirrors. So we might see some of that, just kind of moving things a week this way or that way to make it look like things are better. Not in recent sessions, but past ones, the legislature did use the rainy day fund, especially for the year we're in. For 2017, they might decide to refinance some state spending, so we use the economic stabilization fund there. And so those would both be good things to do. They're better than actual cuts to state schools and to Medicaid, for example, because cuts were made there in 2003 and 2011, and those cuts have not been undone. So we would basically be cutting on top of the existing cuts.
Is this deficit big enough for the average Texan to feel?
I think some are already feeling it if their kids are in overcrowded classrooms. When the state doesn't have enough money to increase that basic allotment that they talked about, then that means more students per teacher. So their parents are going to notice their kids aren't learning as well as they could. Child Protective Services, I think we've heard a lot about what happens when you don't have caseloads that are manageable. So again, depending on who you are. We heard about money going to the highway fund and how that's not the full amount that we hoped when voters approved that. $5 billion was the goal. We're not even there for that. So again, voters may feel like their traffic situation is not improving any, even though there's new money there. So even in things that aren't general revenue funded, voters might notice that things are not getting any better. Yeah.
That was lower because of the sales tax.
Yep, sales tax didn't even
projection.
go up enough. Yeah, it could have been 5, and it was 4.7 billion. But it's the reason why general revenue overall isn't growing at all.
What are you guys most worried about that might get on the chopping block that y'all are going to try to protect?
I think state services that have other ways of paying for them, like higher education. In the past, tuition increases are how we deal with less state support for colleges. But we're hearing lately that tuition increases aren't something that are very popular with our budget writers. So things that have been done in the past to deal with a shortfall of general revenue might not be an option going forward because tuition is a lot higher now than it was before deregulation.
I'll tell you one thing that I hope is off the table is any more tax cuts. One reason this is so short is because some of it's just diversions, taking the sales tax that used to go to the general state budget and sending it only to the highway fund. As the comptroller had said last week, he said normal economic growth has been pre-dedicated, and that's why there's not so much money left for the rest of the budget. But they also cut the franchise tax, you remember, by 1/4. That was $2.6 billion that we could be using now to prevent these cuts. They did that. There have been bills filed to continue those kinds of cuts in the franchise tax. We think those should be off the table from the beginning. They have no place in this current
Do
environment.
you think that's likely, though? Tax cuts are always popular with Republican lawmakers.
Well, they are, but I'm planning on people being realistic. They know that the state needs to provide certain basic services, and we can't afford to even keep up with the current revenue estimate. Tax cuts would just put us deeper into the hole.
Yeah, when you're relying on smoke and mirrors and dedicated balances to make your budget situation balanced, clearly that is not a time for additional tax cuts. What's that saying? If you're in a hole, stop digging. That's exactly the case here.
You know, the other thing is because the state budget's going to be so tight, cities and counties, community colleges and hospital districts may try to make up the difference with local revenue. And as you may know, one of the big issues in this session is going to be an attempt to cap the ability of those local governments to raise the revenue they need to provide some of the services that the state may not be able to in this coming budget.
Would you say the shortfall and the revenue outlook that we have is primarily due to things like oil and gas prices outside of lawmakers' control, or primarily due to things within their control?
I'd say they put themselves more than $10 billion in the hole just from things they did last session and the session before, the diversions and the tax cuts primarily. You know, if you look, oil and gas at $55 or $60, which is what the comptroller said, should be enough to keep us going if we hadn't made all these tax cuts and diversions. Is just going to hamstring the ability of the Finance and Appropriations Committee to write a reasonable budget.
If they're looking to save money, where could, so much is dedicated and connected to federal dollars, where could they cut the money? Where is the money to go to?
Texas ranks 46th in state spending per resident, so we do not have a lot of room to be cutting. We'll actually get calls sometimes from people wanting to know, like, can we eliminate state aid for libraries or museums or like cultural arts kinds of things, and I have to tell them we don't fund that right now, so we can't save money by getting rid of that. You can't cut what's not even there to begin with.
Are you worried at all that, there's, when you have to go fishing, you gotta go where the fish are, that, the money is in education,
Yes.
right? Isn't that where that most likely
That's the
cuts would
concern,
come?
yeah. If you cut public education funding, you are putting more pressure on local school property taxes, which we've heard legislators want to do something about. If you cut state aid to health and human services, you lose additional federal dollars for almost every single general revenue dollar you spend. So cut $1 from Medicaid and you lose $1.50 in federal funds. So they understand that these are some tough choices. In 2011, we heard about 30% cuts to nursing homes, and today we're hearing nursing homes are barely breaking even. So I think they understand that they don't have any choices. They do have a significant rainy day fund, the economic stabilization fund. So that's what we'll point them to.
Any threat to higher ed, do you think, as well?
That's an area where, again, cuts have been so significant. UT Austin and Texas A&M, the flagship universities, get less than 20% of their budget now from the state budget. So, again, it's in the olden days, we used to support them a lot, so we could cut them, but we're not in that situation anymore. But we may still hear proposals for changes in how we fund higher education.
And the way the school finance system works is when local school property values go up, the state has to put in less money from the state budget in order to keep schools fully funded. And so when we're figuring the $109 billion, we're figuring current law, which means the state would save how much?
Well, property taxes for schools, the assumption is 5% increases each year, the next 2 years. That saves the state $3 billion in general revenue.
So that's $3 billion for schools that won't be in the state budget because it's coming out of local school property taxpayers. So if the state were to keep up just its current commitment in dollars to public education, would require, instead of $109, $112 billion.
Yep. But property tax increases, again, that's the trade-off here, and it's why Dick mentioned the effort by local governments. If that's how we're going to fund public services in Texas, we should let cities and counties do that. We shouldn't get in the way of people being able to fund the services that they want locally.
I might have missed this. You had mentioned that you're going to be directing state lawmakers mostly to the rainy day fund, like that's where they should be tapping into. Can you talk about that?
Well, the revenue estimate, the reason it's so important is if legislators want to spend more than that $104.8 billion that we heard about, they either have to raise taxes or use the rainy day fund. Those are basically their two choices. So if they want to go beyond that, they can vote by a 4/5 majority to go beyond. That's not going to happen. So that's why we're reminding them Economic Stabilization Fund was regularly used for Child Protective Services, CHIP, teachers, retired health care. There's a lot of things that are, again, still issues this session that there's a precedent for using the rainy day fund to prevent cuts in those areas. So we're just going to remind them it's the rational, logical way to do it. We did it before. The rainy day fund got down to zero as a balance pretty much in 2005, and nothing happened. Our credit ratings were fine. All the usual excuses you hear why we shouldn't use it. It's a legitimate use, and we think a good thing for them to look to as an alternative to damaging budget cuts.
And I'm guessing more politically feasible than raising taxes.
Yes.
All right. Can you guys ID yourselves quickly?
Sure.
Eva DeLuna Castro, and I'm the director of the Invest in Texas program at the Center for Public Policy Priorities here in Austin.
Thank you.
And my name is Dick Levine, and I'm Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Center for Public Policy Priorities.
Thank you so much.
Good, thank you.
All right.
Good.
And thank everyone for tuning in today. Thank you, Dick and Eva, for your time, for your expertise. If anybody else does have questions, please feel free to post them below in the comment section. We will get to them. And thank you again for tuning with us this morning. We will have more information on this throughout the session. Thank you.
Good.